Cody Butler writes, would love to see a video about the Glycine Airman. Designer notes, subject 50. Let me begin with a question. Which hour is noon? 12 a.m. or 12 p.m.? If it took you a split second to come up with an answer or had to ask Siri about it, do not be ashamed. You're not alone. It's a little flaw in time telling that has a very straightforward solution, really. Use a standard 24-hour scale watch. It's a stroke of simplistic genius only seen this side of a Rolex diver. And arguably the most prominent 24-hour wristwatch is the Glycine Airman. Here's why you should have one in your collection. Glycine is a Swiss brand that began life in 1914. It was founded by Eugene Malin, and the brand initially had success in producing small movements for ladies' watches, which is the dominant demographic of the time. They're a proficient watch company capable of manufacturing their own self-winding and chronometer watches in the 1930s. Charles Hertig bought the company in 1943, and this is when the Airman was born. Like, comment, and subscribe for content you'd like to see next. Follow us on Instagram at Design Atelier Aruba for behind-the-scenes content. Submit your pics and videos to designatelierviewer@gmail.com. The main and most recognizable feature of the Airman is the 24-hour dial. Samuel Glure, then sales director of Atlas, struck a conversation with Captain Brown while on a Thai Airways flight and suggested this feature to Charles Hertig. With 24 hours in a day, there is a clear identification of what time it is without the separation of day or night. This is especially useful when traveling where day and night would meet or cross. Not to mention that many countries use 24 hours as a standard of time telling. At first, it may appear that a conventional watch with 12 hours can be easily converted into a 24-hour watch by simply changing the numerals on the dial. However, this would also require a new movement or at least a set of gears to accommodate a slower progression of the hour hand. There are of course other Airmans that have the conventional 12-hour configuration, but we all prefer the 24-hour setup that the Airman is popular for. The rest of the hands are mounted at the center like other typical watches. A date complication is also a staple of the Airman, as this is also essential for air travel when crossing time zones. Some Airmen have a second time zone, which is also another request by the captain that Mr. Glure talked to. This is very much desired by pilots who welcomes the idea of seeing the home and destination times at the same glance at the watch. Some early Airman models may also display AM and PM marks on the quadrant of the watch. This points out the 12 hours of the day from the latter half. On other models, even the noon mark is printed at the lower half of the dial. Some other scales may be included in the dial, such as the second track or minute track. This makes the dial busier as expected. However, to aid in legibility, Glycine clears the center of the dial as much as possible. This visually squeezes the outer rim of the dial with all of the information. Compare this to the Airman's contemporary, the Breitling Navitimer. The center of the dial is relatively smaller with all of the subdials and at times the branding occupying much of the space. Of course, some of Glycine's Airman models sports a similar configuration as the Navitimer, but the classic Glycine Airman setup is easily the most legible. The name Airman is almost always on the dial of each model, with the exception of the Chief and the SST chronograph. The hands too help in this dial being easily readable. The hour hand is often imposing with a loomed broad arrow profile that does not overlap the numerals. Initially sporting a Dauphine hand, this broad arrow hour hand has become a regular aesthetic to the Airman. Not only is the hour hand not obscuring the numerals, its tip also runs within the negative space of the dial. It provides a much welcome uniformity and order to the otherwise detail-heavy watch face. Some models have a GMT hand that's colored differently to provide a little uniqueness to the function. With this hand, it's often possible to have 3 different time zones to track. another feature to the delight of frequent flyers. Another signature Airman feature is the bidirectional rotating 24-hour bezel. This serves as the second time zone for the Airman. In watch circles, this configuration is called the purist range, which sounds elitist but very appropriate and cool. At the 4 o'clock position, there is a secure friction tab that holds the bezel in place. This is screwed down with its own dedicated crown apart from the main crown at the 3 o'clock position. It's worth noting that the Turnograph from Rolex was the first one to publicly mass-produce a watch with a turning bezel. However, it's Glycine's Airman that had a locking mechanism for the bezel, along with being able to lock it at the middle hour localities since the bezel is not ratcheting. The SST version tried to refresh things up by having a bezel that's equipped inside the crystal and operated with its own crown as well. The Airman, however, does not always have the signature second crown. There are models that sport a ratcheting bezel like many wrist watches. The numerals on these bezels typically alternate between an arrow for odd hours and numerals for even hours. This pattern is almost synonymous with the Airman. However, in the latter models, these triangles started to become like lines that also somewhat defines the modern Airmans. Engraved markings are a common visual feature of these bezels, but they are not reserved to this design. There are bezel insert versions as well. The Airman is commonly on the bigger side of the case dimensions. For the current modern lines of Airmans, 42 to 46mm are available. These case sizes may be too big for the 16cm wrists. There are smaller versions of the Airman starting at 36mm for the 50s and 60s era models, and 39mm models started appearing in the 1970s, along with the reissues of the number ones in the late 2000s. Big as they are, there are even bigger versions of the Airman going up to a monstrous 53mm. Airmans are known for their robust and well-finished construction. The early Airmans are powered by a Felsa 690 or 692 automatic caliber. Felsa is the first automatic movement with a bidirectional rotor that was approved by the Swiss authorities. The bidinator is the first movement used for the Airman. There is a variation between the Felsa 690 and 692 Airmans. Collectors often prefer the Felsa 692 due to it being the raw 23-jewel configuration. All Airmans that have the 692 were sold outside of the United States. Due to the jewel tariffs back in the 50s, Glycine was forced to sidestep additional costs by fitting their Airmans with a caliber 690, which sports only 17 jewels. To differentiate these two Airmans, Glycine printed special on the dial to mark these Airmans as a US market watch. Later in the run, a hacking seconds feature was added to adopt the military accuracy that the Airmans are starting to get used for. What's fascinating with this hacking seconds feature is that once the crown is pulled, the second hand would in fact continue to run. It would only be stopped at the 24-hour position by a small wire that pops out in between the 2 and 4 numerals when the crown was pulled. This would make for a cleverly accurate hacking mechanism, although the user will need to wait at the most 59 seconds before they could set the second's hand. So if you're in the market for a vintage Airman, make sure to look for this wire popping mechanism at the 24-hour position. Other calibers were also utilized, such as the A-Shields and chronograph movements used in the SST models. FHF and ETA quartz were also used for a time to save the company from a doomed fate like other watch brands. Later, the Airmen started to use ETA automatic movements again, and later modified them with their own parts like in the caliber GL230 and the GL293. Through the years, the Airmen had many iterations, but without any question, the most iconic configuration was the white dial on a dark strap with an all-metal bezel. This is affectionately called the first Airman. There's a similar version sold on Turner stores exclusively, and these were named the Chief. The Chief has a distinction somewhat for the Navy class opposed to the Airman for the Air Force. Both the Airman and the Chief have been re-released as the number 1 and the Airman Vintage the Chief. The modern Airmans have departed quite a bit from the original design by now sporting a syringe hand and a lined bezel instead of the original triangles. These may also come in a bronze case or a PBD-coded version. There are a couple of notable airmans, such as a full black version and a full lume dial configuration. Starting at 42mm, these modern airmans have grown up to 46mm as well. For those who couldn't stand the 24-hour timekeeping, there are now 12-hour versions, such as the Double 12 and the Airwoman, that is aimed for women. If you paid half the attention, you know by now the profile of an airman if you saw one. But with the SST version, you'll for sure mistake it for something else if you didn't see the airman name on it. Well, one of them didn't even have one in the first place. The SST Airman, standing for Supersonic Travel, was Glycine's attempt to capitalize from the transcontinental travel interest that the Concorde and an experimental Boeing aircraft helped spurn. These SST models have an inner rotating bezel and a sleeker case profile that evokes the spirit of these ridiculously fast airliners. In keeping with the travel theme, in 1990, Glycine launched the Airman World Time. This one not only has the signature 24-hour bezel and scales, it also has the localities at the outer bezel. It looks odd and curvy. It's a sign of the times. There are other odd airmans, such as the Airfighter chronograph that comes with a sliding chronograph mechanism. On top of this, there's even a skeletonized version that, well, completely departs from the Airman mantra. Good luck reading all those laps in these models. The most odd airman is probably the Airman 7. If you ever wondered what it would feel like to wear 3 watches at the same time, this is it. And you don't need an extra wrist to do it. Sporting 3 automatic timepieces in a humongous 53mm case, this non-G-Shock and pre-Invicta acquisition Airman can track not only 3 separate time zones, but actually 4. One for each subwatch. Yes, I can't believe I'm saying subwatch and not subdial, and a main movement that's equipped with a local time and world time. Who needs a 24-hour outer bezel? Oh, and then there's the Plaza Mayor, which is practically the Airman 7 in high definition. And finally, there's the Play It Again Sam Gold Airman's box set 1 of 1 that has 3 Airman examples in silver, yellow gold, and red gold cases. These have new old stock examples of the Felsa movement inside of each. Airmans typically sell for under $2,000, which is reasonable for the features you're getting. These common models are fairly easy to find and discounted modestly. Vintage examples can easily break the $2K threshold. At just over $500, you can also get a decent pre-owned model, worth considering for the iconic aviation watch line. Glycine is now owned by Invicta. As confused many of us are about the 12 o'clock question we started out in this video, many were equally scratching their heads when the fashion brand bought this Swiss brand and its unique signature travel timepiece with a rich heritage. Does this mean we will start to see gougy, horrendous looking bricks on the wrist from Glycine? No, we won't, according to Invicta. Well, at least they're not gonna touch Glycine at all. They just want to throw in their money and fund this little Swiss outfit. If Glycine chooses to make another 50mm arm clock, it's Glycine's own prerogative. Aside from that, we can continue to enjoy and collect a unique piece of history of a 24-hour watch like how the rest of the world enjoys this standard time. It's easy to read and easy to identify. It's as cleverly reliable in the air as the Submariner was under the ocean. It's got the heritage without costing an appendage. Just don't pick anything near 50mm. The Glycine Airman not only saved the watch company from the brink of extinction, it came to define the brand and the whole subgenre in watchmaking while it's at it. That could be reason enough to deserve a spot in your collection.